This meeting is being recorded. Hello, everyone. Today we're representing the second masterclass of ISDL, Indian State Debating League. And today we have special guest, Harish Natarajan. And I guess I need not to tell you about Harish, but still, let me just remind you for your if you have missed out. So Harish is the first person to beat IBM's AI engine. It's the same engine which have beaten like IBM Chess Blue. Is also a former European debating coach, currently coach at Hong Kong national debating team, quote unquote, national debating team, and alumni of Oxbridge, both Oxford and Cambridge. Also being he's the person, the mentor to us in organizing Ideal last year, the biggest tournament that we have ever run. And yeah, he's one of the best debater among the world that we knows, not just in India, among the world. And with that, let me just introduce Harish to you. Hello, Harish. I'm just gonna unmute you. Yes, you can.
Hello, everyone. Hi, so it's great to be here. Hope you've all had a good start at the new year thus far. And I'm just going to talk about a few things related to debating, but in particular, I was going to talk a little bit about a few lessons I've learned over the years about what to do when you get emotion. And that, lots of these sessions are how to craft the perfect speech. But even before you start that, you get a topic. And the question is, what should be going through your mind? How should you think about that topic to start constructing the best case you could have? And that could be true if you have 3 weeks to prepare, 2 days to prepare, or 1 hour, or even 15 minutes to prepare. And I think there's just a checklist of a few ideas which can allow us to present the best cases possible. And like most things related to debating, it is useful for debating itself, but well beyond that, the way in which you think about crafting a good argument in a debate isn't that different than how you would craft a good argument in an essay, whether that be an essay in politics, English literature, science, whatever. So with that in mind, I'm going to go through a few of the tips I have of what you do when you get a topic, and hopefully we can talk through some of them and what I think the insights you can learn are. The first place to start is just a misconception I think lots of people run into when they get a debate motion, which is you get a motion. Let's go for something fairly straightforward but topical. So lift all patents on medical technology or new drugs. So that would mean that currently even COVID drugs are patented, which means that not everyone can produce them. Only the private company which designs them and originally came up with them has the right to produce it. And what should you think about? Well, often people just jump immediately into arguments. Well, what are the reasons for this? Or what are the reasons against this? What I want to suggest is there's probably a slightly better, more refined way of thinking about these topics. So what's the first question I would ask when I get a topic? The first is, what would we ideally want the world to look like? Every single debate you ever get is 2 questions in the most simple sense, which is what ideally would the world look like? And we move closer or further away from that world. So the place to start is asking, what are we actually aiming to do with this topic? And we should think about that relatively broadly. It could be when it comes to lifting patents of medical technology that our only concern, the only thing an ideal world will look like is that those drugs go to the people who need it the most. And that's fine, but it should be the baseline of our thinking. We should verbalize what we're aiming at. But I want to go even a little bit further than that. Don't just state what you really want the world to look like, which is your goal. Think critically about what alternative goals could be. Could it be we want to ensure not just the drugs go to the people who need them the most, but we're also producing drugs for new diseases, new viruses which come up. And the reason I think we need to be critical when we say what we want the world to look like is both sides in the debate may have different versions of what the ideal world will look like. Maybe if you're lifting technology, your ideal world is one where everyone has access to the drugs if they need it. The opposition may agree on that, but they also think that you need lots of new drugs in place. And that's why the place to start is asking, what is our ideal world? And why is that our ideal world? Because that in and of itself is going to be the core for every argument we make, but it is not going to be uncontested. So what does our ideal world look like? Why is that our ideal world? What are the alternatives which potentially could be in place? Potentially, the answer is both of them. Our ideal world is where we get more drugs being produced and better ones for important diseases, and those are accessible. But we need to formulate that issue to begin with so we know what we're aiming to do. And that, I think, should be a lesson for every debate. Start with that question. What are we aiming to do? The second is, what exactly are we comparing it with? And that's because in any debate, we're comparing two different versions of the world. One where the motion passes and one where the motion fails. And we could give reasons why it's great that people have drugs. People otherwise saved from diseases they don't saved from diseases which we could prevent, that people live longer. And that's all great. But that's not quite the question in the debate. The question is not, is this good in and of itself? It is, of course, good in and of itself that people have access to these drugs. But it's compared to their world. Why is this good? And that's a slightly different question. Let's talk again about patents, and let's just look at COVID. How extensive is the problem that people don't have access to COVID drugs in a world with patents? And you could, of course, argue lots of you have undersupply of these drugs. Well, is that an issue because of a patent system, or is that an issue because we don't have production facilities in place? Is that not an issue when it comes to drugs which are not under patents? And that's just a second comment which is important to realize, which is, what are we comparing our world to? And we are not comparing it to, we are not just saying it is good in and of itself compared to nothing, but compared to what happens if this motion does not pass. To take a different example of that, which might be more clear, let's say you're in opposition and you're arguing legalize recreational drugs. And you want to make the argument in opposition that we don't want people to take drugs. And you can make that very compelling, so all the harms which exist. But is it true that in a world where these drugs are illegal, people aren't taking them? No, we certainly know that people take illegal drugs anyway. So you are not comparing it with a perfect world where no one is taking these drugs on one side when you make them illegal, and lots of people are taking them when you make them legal. In both worlds, there are at least some people who will be taking illegal drugs. So what's your comparison here? Your comparison isn't just people taking illegal drugs is bad. It is instead, because of this policy, either far more people take them or something along those lines. It's a subtle difference, but an incredibly important one. Because if all you say is, we don't want anyone taking these drugs, the other side responds by saying, I can agree with that, but in the real world, even when drugs are illegal, people take them. So your argument needs to be ever so slightly different. It has to now be, because these drugs are legal, so many more people will take them compared to when these drugs are illegal. And yes, on both sides, some people will take illegal drugs, but it is much worse on our side. And you need to think about that when it comes to every single argument you make. Because what are you actually comparing it with? You cannot assume that you get all the outcomes you want, that there's no mitigation on the other side. You need to be able to show, compared to what the other side is claiming the world looks like, why is this better or why is this worse? So it could be that even once you have patents on medical drugs, people still get access to them. Maybe this is because companies care about their reputation, so don't overcharge for these drugs. Well, if that's the case, you still need to compare your world to that world, not your world to one which is fictional. So that's the second lesson. Think about what you're actually comparing your case with. And it is not going to be an ideal or dystopic world from the other side. It's going to be what they think is actually happening instead. And why is our world better than their world? Not as why is our world better than a hypothetical where everything works or everything fails. And you have to think about that with every argument you make. Let's compare our world with their world. Let's just not talk about why our world is good. So it's not just like why no one taking drugs is good. It's why far fewer people take drugs on our side than their side, depending on what the motion is. Hopefully that should make sense. But as you see more and more debates, you have to think about the real world comparison. And it is unlikely to be the extreme comparisons which you'll otherwise often think about making. So I think that's a very important point when it comes to making every argument. You need to show your side is better to theirs, but use the real comparison, not a convenient one for your side. The third thing is, do the arguments change depending on context? And what does that actually mean? So let's think about a motion, quotas for university admissions. And we'll all start with a different context in our head based on what we immediately know and what we see in newspapers. But there certainly are going to be differences on what this looks like from country to country, from state to state. And that should be fairly trivial to you. That, sure, maybe in the United States, this is about African Americans. Maybe in France, it's going to be about people from North African and Arab descent. In India, it may be about different kinds of castes and who should get preference or not. All those debates may have a similar core. They're all a little bit different. And you need to double check, are the arguments I'm running true about all contexts, or are they only true about my specific context? And this, I think, is an important point, because in that university admissions debate, arguably, in all of those examples, there's a fairly common core, which is here are groups which have disadvantages when it comes to applications, and therefore they should be prioritized. Fair enough. But in different contexts, some of those arguments may not apply. Let's say we're talking about political systems, and it is supporting a electoral system, supporting a presidential system, over one with a prime minister. Well, what that means in the United States versus India is clearly very different. And you need to be thinking, do my arguments work in all of these contexts? Or if you're looking, for instance, at a debate about prioritizing women in university admissions, that may be a really big issue in parts of the developing world, but in parts of the developed world, where women might be a majority of individuals in universities, the arguments need to be different. And there's two things which I think are important to appreciate because of that. First, when you're coming up with an argument, ask yourself, what's my premise here? What do I think the world looks like that makes my arguments valid? In the university and women, it could easily be that I am assuming that the majority of people who get into university right now are men. Is that true? In some cases, yes. In other cases, no. And there are two things which you may then do if you realize that your arguments are only going to be relevant in a subset of cases. Either you then have to say, these are the important cases in the debate. Yes, maybe it doesn't work like this in all of the world, but where this debate matters the most, it works like that. That's one way of doing so. So your context may just be more important, or it could just be much more likely that, sure, there are going to be some cases which in Sweden, where the world looks very different, but that is a minority of cases. That's one approach to it. The other one is just to expand the arguments, to say, okay, I have a set of arguments which applies in these areas, and another set of arguments which apply in a different set of areas. And you can run both as long as you're explicit that the arguments which apply in this case, and here are the arguments which apply in the second set of cases. So that's my third thing I think you all need to consider when you get a motion. How do my arguments change depending on context, depending on the people involved, depending on the countries involved, and the assumptions about what these different countries look like. So comparing developed to developing countries, countries where women are more equal to less equal, ones where you have large, which are ethnically very similar versus ones which are ethnically very diverse. And just think about, do those arguments apply in all cases? And if they don't, think about whether you can say, my set of cases is the most important, or have arguments which apply to one set and arguments which apply to both, to the second set, but be explicit about it. So the fourth is there a principle that I want to run here? And this, I think, is another important point we often miss when we think about debates. That we look at it from a very practical lens. What happens as a result? Overall, do we get more positive outcomes or more negative outcomes? I don't want to dissuade you from doing that, but there is a second set of arguments or group of arguments which are useful to have thought about and be able to run. And these are arguments which are often principle arguments, which is they argue broadly, we have an obligation to do something, potentially irrespective of what the plausible or probable outcomes would be. To give you an example, if there is a debate about restricting free speech in any one of multiple forms, you could talk about whether those restrictions are positive or negative, whether they lead to a better political society, whether they suppress potentially some dangerous ideas, whether they lead to the strengthening or weakening of extremist groups. You can make arguments on both sides related to it. But maybe there's another argument, which is that the state should not be suppressing the views its citizens are able to express and the views that its citizens are able to hear. Because why should the state, which is broadly just a group of men who through threat of force tell you what you can and cannot do, have the right to say what I can or cannot say, or what I can or cannot hear? Is there any individual who you think should have the power to tell you what you should say, or you what you should hear? And you can expand this argument in multiple different ways, but I think the important claim here is that doesn't necessarily rely on you proving the restriction is good or the restriction is bad. It is saying that we have an obligation, that in principle, we have an obligation not to restrict speech. Now, you can lighten these principles. You could say an obligation not to do it except in the most extreme circumstance. And this isn't the most extreme circumstance. It's not incitement to violence. All the other side says is possibly it could lead to it, as could so many other outcomes. But the core issue is, think about what those principles potentially could be. And some of them should be even simpler than that. You could, if you look at, for instance, in the UK, one of the arguments that people have made against reparations for former colonies is it would make the situation in colonies worse. All the money would be squandered. Let's assume for a second that's true. Does that mean that you don't have an obligation to pay for the crimes you've committed and the harms you've committed in the past, because maybe some of that money plausibly could be wasted. And the answer may well be no in those cases, because there's a principal reason, a principal obligation to provide reparations for crimes committed. It does not matter if that money, some of that money may be wasted, because you have an obligation to do it. And there are hundreds of different principal arguments we can make. We could say, for instance, that why should we be giving money to charity? Well, it's not necessarily just because this charity may be more effective than this one, blah, 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 blah. It's because we have an obligation to help people when we can, because because the core of morality is that all people, irrespective of where they are from, should be of equal worth. And to protect, say, my child, I would give up a huge amount. Surely I should be willing to spend a huge amount to protect your child as well. So I think there are these entire set of arguments, which is broadly principal arguments that we should be comfortable being able to make. And here's an important point I want to say about all of this. Most of those arguments are arguments we could probably come up with well before a debate starts. We could come up with it right now, what some of those principles could be and how they could be useful in different debates. But we often don't do that. But if we did, it becomes very easy for us to do so. So then let's move on to the next point. What interests should we care about the most? And what effects should we care about the most? Often what happens in a debate is we jump to the idea that there are going to be arguments, we need to win every single one of these arguments. But in the real world, if you set a debate, the odds are, as long as it's reasonably balanced, i.e. there are arguments on both sides, there are going to be arguments for the policy and arguments against the policy. Take a trivial example, like the state should provide free education for everyone. We probably all agree that that's something which a state should do, at least on some level. But there is definitely an argument in opposition, which is this costs money, and we can use money for other things. That's a triviality. But it is an argument the opposition can make. And let's be honest, the opposition is correct. That is money the state is spending, and it is money that could be spent, at least for the short term, on other things. We could try and negate the argument. So there's obviously ways of responding to it, that in the longer term, you make more money as a result, et cetera, et cetera. But remember, for most debates, there will be some arguments you win, there'll be some arguments you lose. The question at the end of the debate is, why are the arguments I win more important than the arguments I lose? So when constructing your case, what you have to ask yourself is, what matters more? And why does it matter more? Why, in this case, is education so important? And it could be important for principal reasons, that without education, people don't have autonomy, that they don't have opportunities, that are unable to get jobs, that without free education, they're unable to get jobs, that it is the poorest in society who are most likely to be stuck in positions because they don't have the ability to do better as a result. All of those definitively ways of trying to explain why your argument really matters, and potentially then why your argument matters more than the arguments of the other side. So when you're making an argument and you're constructing a case, don't think that all you need to do is say, here is an argument, here's why it's true, something about why it's important. Ask yourself, why does this really matter? Because I am going to lose arguments in this debate. There are going to be things the other side says which is correct. So why should this matter the most? Which is a way of saying, what effects really matter in this debate? which group of people should I prioritize the absolute most in the debate? Use another example of that, the one about drug companies and removing patents. This policy means drug companies lose money. That is a negative effect. Is it a particularly important negative effect? Quite possibly not, particularly if you are comparing it with lots of people now having access to drugs. But if you're thinking about this theoretically, what you need to tell me is, yes, it is true that some large multi-billion-dollar corporations are going to have reduced profits. That should not be the effect or the interest we care the most about, because we're comparing that with many more individuals, people who lack opportunities, et cetera, being deprived of their right to live or have a reasonable standard of living. Well, so here are two effects. More people on the prop side get access to drugs. On the op side, drug companies lose money. Both of these are may well definitively be true. You can do some mitigation, some responsiveness. But the real question is, why does your effect, the group that you care about, matter more? And that's then the question you should ask yourself every time you make an argument. So not just is this true, but why is this the interest I need to care about? Or when I say I need to care about, your audience needs to care about. Why is this effect on them the one I need to care about the most? And once you've done that, so once you've done those 5 ones, let's think about some generic ways in which you can start thinking about building arguments. So here are a few of them. Who are the relevant groups involved, the relevant decision makers? How are they affected? What are their incentives? And how do they act based on those incentives? Which is a very easy way of thinking about lots of debates is lots of debates, almost all debates are about people and what people would rationally want to do. And they all want to maximize something. That could be somewhat more complicated. Let's say we're talking about a politician. Taking out all the complexities, for a politician in a democratic society, you could probably approximate their interest to getting reelected. If you're not reelected, you can't push your ideology. If you want to be more cynical, if you're not reelected and you don't have a position of power, you're going to struggle a little bit more to steal money via corruption. However you want to put it, reelection might well be the most important aim for a politician. Well, given that, how do you maximize your chances of being reelected? And how does that change? Well, you have your interest, the chance of being reelected. Now, how do you act on that? It could be you try and pass policy which is beneficial to the majority, more precisely the median individual in a political area who's likely to vote for you. Plausibly, is another way you potentially do that by trying to appeal to interest groups, trying to appeal to whether it be political lobbies, religious, ethnic constituencies, and try and make sure they come out and vote for you. Now, the reason I say this is almost every debate can be broken down in that way. Who are we talking about here? Who's making these decisions? Well, what is their interest? And how do they act on their interest? And how does that change as a result of the policy? So let's pick a fairly straightforward debate to see how this works in practice. So this house would ban advertising. And you're asking yourself, well, okay, you're a company. What's your interest? Probably to maximize profit. Now, you can't advertise. What does that imply? Well, it's harder for you to expand your market by making your goods seem to be really cool. Okay, fair enough. So what are you going to do instead? You could potentially do nothing, in which case your profits are shrinking, or are there other things you could potentially do to increase your profits? Maybe you'll be reducing your prices. And this isn't hypothetical. It's in the United Kingdom, about 20 years ago, we banned advertising of cigarettes. Well, the aim of the ban was to reduce the number of people smoking. One of the problems, though, is what did companies do? Rather than just accept reduced profits because fewer people are buying cigarettes, they reduced the price. Reducing the price meant it was cheaper for people to buy more cigarettes, and indeed, overall, total demand increased, at least in the short term. Now, that's just one illustration, but what you need to think about is, here is the incentive, or what a company is aiming at. Here's the new policy in place. What do they do now? What they're aiming at hasn't really changed, but there's new constraints on them. And sometimes that's positive. Maybe as a result of the company which was producing cigarettes decides to move into other areas, healthier, less regulated forms of tobacco, e-cigarettes, for instance, healthier, by which I mean like marginally healthier, ones which are less unregulated, or they stay in the same market that they're currently in and just reduce prices, and maybe they increase demand as a result. Both of those are plausible outcomes, and we can get them logically without any further knowledge by just starting with the idea of what are these companies actually aiming to do, what are their incentives, and how can they act on those incentives. Now, you can do that in almost every debate, but I add one additional complication, which I think can be useful in many debates, which is it's great starting with the assumption that individuals make maximizing decisions, which is we have things we aim for, and then we do what we need to do to reach those targets. But in reality, there's lots of reasons we don't act fully rationally. Sometimes we lack the information. We just don't know what the implications of our decision are. So if I'm deciding who to vote for, well, I won't necessarily know which candidates' policies are in my best interest if I don't know all of their policies. But that's actually the way most people vote. Do you think most people carefully read the manifestos, all the policy promises, think about to what degree these are all plausible, look at track records, and then work out whether they will be passed? No. One of the reasons people don't do that is it's so difficult and time-consuming to accumulate all that knowledge that we can just use shortcuts that, they have generally done something good for me. My parents and my family members think they're a better political party. I like that they want to build a wall to prevent immigration. These are all things which people actually vote on, even though taken together, that policy or the candidate may not be in their best interest. And that's a case where our incentive is we want a politician to vote for the politician who's going to do the best for us, and we'll vote based on that, except because of knowledge gaps, we aren't able to accurately assess it and may use shortcuts to information. Or there's other biases in decision making. So if you're a sports team 20 years ago looking for the best players, while currently lots of teams use careful statistics and analytics, go back 20 years, you aren't really using careful analytics. You're looking for, is that person tall? Does he look like the players who played well for the last 10 years? Does he seem like he hits the ball hard or can kick hard? And that's because you're using the wrong metrics. Some of these are biased information that you're saying, oh, well, this worked in the past, I'm going to continue using that information. Sometimes it's when you get information, you go, I find that more credible than that, etc. So it's a complication to it, which is you can look at what the incentives are. How do you maximize based on it? And there's multiple options. And then ask yourself, well, do we actually act in a fully rational way? Maybe not because we lack information, maybe because other biases in how we make decisions. And related to that is what I guess my seventh point would be. Are our effects plausible rather than probable? What do I mean by that? So let's come up with an example. Let's go back to legalizing all recreational drugs, so marijuana, for instance. Well, you could argue that if we legalize all of these drugs, more people will use them because it's easier to get access, for instance. You could also argue, plausibly, that one of the major reasons people buy clothes right now, why would a piece of clothing with a black shirt with a Ralph Lauren logo be worth 100 times more than a black shirt? They are effectively the same good. What is a logo and what doesn't? Well, it's because what's important isn't necessarily the enjoyment we get out of the good itself, but maybe what it says about us, that we want to associate ourselves with a certain kind of lifestyle. And the same could be true about illegal drugs. The fact they're illegal is one of the reasons people take them. It's rebellious. Now, both of these are plausible arguments, right? It could be people consume more because they're easier to access. Could be people consume fewer because you lose the illegality and the rebelliousness of use. And both of these effects have been shown to exist. Now, you can claim either one of these, but you're not winning the argument by just claiming one of these, because they can both be true together. The question is, which one is more important? And overall, then, it isn't just possible that people consume fewer drugs because it's legal, because that doesn't seem very likely. There might be a logical version of the world where we can get to that outcome. But probabilistically, one effect will dominate over the other effect. So from anything which involves humans, again, look at the cigarettes example. Once you ban advertising, are you going to sell fewer, or are you going to cut prices and potentially sell as many or more? Both of those are possible. Which one of those is more probable? And this happens a lot in debates, and a lot when we think about things logically, which is there can be very different reactions to the same thing. Well, they are both plausible outcomes, but which one is more probable? So that's the question to ask yourself there. The eighth one here is, are we concrete in explaining how we get to our outcomes? So if you think about an argument, we have a statement, something we want to prove. Great. The second part of that is we explain why that matters, and now we try and explain why we get to that outcome. Well, what kind of words are we using? What kind of explanations are we using? Are we saying that a government won't engage in corruption because it harms their reputation? That's probably true, but what does that actually mean? Let's explain this concretely in a way which actually makes sense to the average person. Not just that your reputation is harmed, it is that what is actually happening is that you know you might get negative coverage of this that reduces your likelihood of being re-elected and therefore losing power. One of those explanations is a lot more concrete than the other, even though they're based on the same idea. And the final one, just before we turn to some questions, is on what areas are we strongest in this debate? And in what areas are we weakest? So again, that is, we win some arguments, we lose some arguments. We might be contesting all of them. But ask yourself, either before the debate and during the debate, okay, we're probably winning these arguments, we're struggling a little bit more on these. But that's fine, because now you know the question is, why can I prove that the arguments I'm winning are more important than the arguments I'm losing? If so, how can I explain that? And that's not a natural way for us to think when we are in a debate, but a much more natural way for us to think when writing an essay, for instance. You make an argument, you kind of know the counter arguments, and you try and explain why they're not that powerful. And even if they are, overall, your argument still stands. But that's what you're doing in debate as well. The difficulty is when we are in the debate and we're contesting all these arguments, we're jumping to, we won all these arguments. So we don't need to explain why what we won is more important than what we lost because we won everything. But that's rarely going to be the case when a judge is watching that debate. They'll probably think you'll be much stronger in proving this, this, and this than you have been on this, this, and this. Or you've lost some of those arguments. And you need to realize from the start that you're probably going to be in that position. Even if you win every argument, you probably win some much more compellingly and conclusively than others. And it isn't ideal that you just go and say, we won this argument. It's to say, here's the argument we won, and this is why winning that argument means so much at the end of this debate for whether we should win it. So just to then go through some of these again, what should we think about in prep? So ask yourself, what are we aiming to do? What does our ideal world look like? And think about their ideal world. Second, what are we comparing our world to? Not a utopian world or a dystopian world, but against what the other side is actually saying. And why, compared to their world, is ours better? Have we thought about how context changes? And what does that mean? Do our arguments apply only in some cases? And if so, have we shown those are the most important cases? Do they apply in all cases? Or do we need to say some arguments apply in these cases, others in different cases? Have we thought about the principle in a debate? Something which goes beyond the practical arguments, which can often say, irrespective of the outcome, we should not be doing this. Irrespective of what is likely the outcome, we should not be doing this. Have we thought about whose interests and effects we should care most about? Have we thought about who the relevant and important decision makers are? What are their interests? What are their incentives? How do those incentives change and what do they do about it? And are they acting in a way which is fully rational? Have we shown our arguments are probable, not just plausible? Are we being concrete in how we explain things? And what our arguments are the strongest? And have we shown why they are the ones which win us the debate? So those would be 9.5 lessons as to things I think you should think about in prep. But I'll now turn to some questions either on this or anything else.
So I guess a lot of questions are there. I will pick the student and will ask them directly the questions. So instead of you picking from the chat, I will make them ask their questions. So let me go one by one. Let me go with the Manraj. And others can just virtually raise their hand so I can come to them. Just Manraj Singh, you can go.
Yes, thank you, sir. Thank you. So first of all, I had a question, like if we get a not a balanced motion, for example, if we get like the global supply chain should be managed by big private organizations. So we know that this is the kind of an idea which is a bit of a capitalist mindset, and we cannot rebut our opponent on the basis of like it is bit of capitalist and neoliberal. So like how would you defend your case in that? So like should we rebut on the main basis of the topic in which the element is being set up, or should we look on other ways to rebut the topic?
So I think that's a very context dependent question, right? As in, it really depends on how much of a difficulty you have. What I think you're maybe pointing to there, and I guess this is true about all communities debating intellectual university, is there's some prisms in which we think, right? It could be pro-capitalist, it could be anti-capitalist, it could be more left-wing, it could be more right-wing. There could be different kinds of arguments we're going to be familiar with. In that world, there are two things which you should do. I mean, just on a general intellectual curiosity issue, try and be familiar with as many ways of thinking as we could. Look at the premises of your own thinking and their thinking and say, how do we challenge it? If I'm naturally quite left-wing, well, it's not that being right-wing or being neoliberal has no perspective. You're not going to find neoliberals who will say, screw the poor. That isn't actually neoliberal position. It's that this is a better way of helping individuals everywhere, would be a neoliberal position. Can you argue from that perspective? And if you can do so, you're challenging them on a higher level than going, well, let's look at it from your anti-capitalist perspective. Why could we still be correct? That would be the first general claim I would make. Have that intellectual curiosity to realize people have very different positions, though often we have very similar end goals. And the neoliberal versus more interventionist version, actually the goals may not be as distinct as they otherwise seem that they could be. But it is also useful to say, even in your world, we still disagree with you. And that can be fine as well. It depends on the topic itself. But I think my general rule would be use debating as a way of expanding your intellectual curiosity for things which you instinctively think are wrong. I am pretty sure if you read deeper into most of them, you will find things you agree with, or at the very least can explain. And then you'll be able to challenge the existing arguments through slightly new prisms. And then maybe you go into their own theory and say, I disagree with it, using your own ideas of what's important, how the world works, but you can do both.
Thank you, Harish. We have 3 hand raised, so let me go first with the Pari. Now it's 4.
Greetings, sir. So basically, like when we are debating, so let's say I'm from the proposition. So should I be looking to find a middle ground and maybe hint at the aspect that I'm open to negotiations, or should I be sticking like very hardly to the topic till the end?
So your burden in a debate is to prove that on balance, your side of the debate is correct. What that doesn't mean is you need to win every single argument and you need to win by a massive distance. Think of a spectrum, which is this is the middle. You need to just prove you're on this side of it, not that you're all the way over here. And negotiation, I guess, in a debate is being willing to move closer to the middle. But actually, that's sometimes a very good idea, maybe something you should be thinking about from the very start, which is both sides have arguments which are likely to be true. I can concede that and still convince someone that they should be on this side of the middle. So yes, you can take hard lines and go, the extreme is correct, but that is rarely going to be the best way of winning a debate. Now, I want to be careful about saying this because you don't want to say they want to do this. They claim in this debate we should nationalize all industry. We think you should nationalize all industry except this one industry. That really isn't a good debate. Indeed, probably isn't an optimal way of debating that at all. But sometimes accepting there is truth on the other side, absolutely fine. You don't need to disagree with everything they're saying. You only need to prove at the end you are slightly in support of a topic. Don't take that too literally, because then you often just end up in a zone of agreement where you are agreeing with them entirely, which does mean you lose. But you can agree with them on occasion. You can seem to sound reasonable, like, yeah, they have a point. Sometimes not all of our arguments are always going to be good. There are going to be negative effects. There could be cases where what we're saying on balance isn't something we think is always good. To give you another illustration of that, which is social media. Social media, and let's look at news, which is social media leads to high variance, by which I mean you can get the best investigatory journalism, news stories uncovered, which really do have a big impact on democracy. You also get nonsense, fake news, and hatred spreading. Both of those things are true simultaneously. The question isn't whether they're both true simultaneously, which I think is something which you have to concede, because those are both empirical facts. It's which one is more important than the other. And the reasonable position isn't to go, there is no fake news on social media. There's never been WhatsApp groups which are inciting violence, because clearly that happens. It's to say all phenomena have positive effects and negative effects. The question is the positive greater than negative? And for these reasons, the positive is. So your burden becomes a little bit different. It isn't saying no negative. It is to compromise in a sense, go, yes, there's negatives, but irrespective of those, the positive is greater for these reasons.
Thank you, Harish. Now we have Sneh Shukla.
Hi, right. So my question was regarding this third point that you talked about, wherein we are trying to compare our world with the opposite side's world. And I just look at this possibility, which I believe a lot of debaters actually use as well, that irrespective of what my side's world is, your side's world is still worse than the reality that we have today. So do you believe that is a sort of side or sort of a segment that someone should, as a debater, run or try to
Right.
prioritize?
Yeah, so the case you're mentioning, I think, is a specific example of what I'm highlighting, which is, let's say one side says, my world is the status quo, which is basically what you're now saying, which is the world I am standing for is the world as it is now. In that case, saying your world is worse than the world we have right now is comparing your world to my world. So it's the same kind of idea. Now, what I don't mean by this comparison is both sides have to say, we're making big changes to the world. It's just to be aware that you're not comparing yourself to a pretend imaginary world. Because even if you're comparing it with the status quo, that is a constant comparison to the world as it is right now. And the drug example, I think, is a good one of that, because I am comparing a world where drugs are legal to a world where drugs are illegal, i.e., generally speaking, drugs are illegal under the status quo. But what does that world actually look like? And what that world doesn't look like is no one takes drugs. So in that example, you are actually comparing yourself with the world as it is right now, but you have to be concrete and reasonable as to what the world is right now. So the two approaches are the same in most debates, where one side stands behind the world as it is now, but you do need to explain what the world as it is now looks like. And you are comparing it with that world, not the imaginary pretend of what the world is right now.
Okay, we have Aditya. We have three more, so I will go Aditya first.
Yeah. Hey, Harish, so I had a doubt about like your negotiation stance. So, for example, if I'm opposed with a point which I necessarily agree with, I would adopt an approach, first of all, agreeing with that person, but then after that, I would point out the certain defects in their argument and showcase how my argument is better. Essentially, like incentivizing them to my side of the argument. But I don't know how the debate format would work in that sense. But like, would you classify that as like a respectable strategy in terms of like maintaining the intellectual discussion?
Right. Again, I think it's a bit context dependent, because keep this in mind. What you are trying to prove at the end is, on balance, my side of the debate is correct. What that means is I can agree, theoretically, potentially, with all of your arguments. Probably not really, but theoretically, I could agree with all of your arguments and just say, here is a bigger argument that even though everything you're saying is true, this thing outweighs everything you are saying. Now, that is a plausible way of arguing. Now, don't take it to that extreme in most cases, but what it really means is you can agree with some of what they're saying and still not lose the debate. Now, I think you're suggesting something a little bit deeper than that, which is you go, I agree what you're saying, but it's not as big or as important as what you're saying it is because of these defects in your arguments or these counter arguments. And that's great because, again, what you're saying is, look, your argument, if entirely true, is really powerful for your side. I agree with your argument, but it's not that big, it's this big. And what you're doing there is a strategy of mitigation, which is, yes, your argument is true. I agree with it generally, but it's not as important, or the effect isn't as large, or it isn't as relevant as you think it is. With that in mind, my other arguments, even though your argument is true, my other arguments are bigger and therefore outweigh it. So if you think about the three approaches you can have to respond to another argument, you can accept it entirely and just claim all my arguments outweigh it. You can well, four approaches. You can eliminate entirely. You can disagree with every part of the argument, so it has no weight in the debate. You can plausibly say, this is the extra one, that it's actually, you say it's bad, but it's actually good. Or, and this is what you're suggesting, your argument is true, but it isn't that important. And thus, once you do the maths by the end of the debate, which is, yes, you won this argument, but it's only this important, but we won this argument, which is that important, I'm winning overall. So if you think about those 3.5 different ways of responding, all of them can be valued. But if what you're doing is mitigating, i.e. agreeing and saying it's not quite as powerful, great. But you can only win the debate then if you have an argument on your own side, which is at least, which is more important or more impactful than the positive or negative effect they have.
Okay, then we have Sarah. So we have Sarah, Pari, Ahalya. I guess that's the last question. Then I guess I have to leave. So Sarah, you go.
Greetings, sir. Actually, I want to ask, what should be our take on the factual errors? And should we believe in more making reply speeches or using point of informations?
Okay, on factual errors. So it depends, right? So a factual error is not ideal for a side when they have it. But what does it really matter if their facts are slightly incorrect? It may be worth pointing out, but has this actually undermined the logic of what they are doing? So you could say, look, that is untrue because of this reason, or this is simply not true. But think about this like in the political arena. Politicians lie all the time, they get away with it. Now, this isn't a strict analogy to a debate, but normally, a judge won't necessarily know what is factually true. And to claim something is factually false, at best makes them normally go, I don't really know what the truth is. The more important point is either use that factual error and say, here is what is true, and why is this true? Because that's building the logic. Now, facts are wonderful because what they're able to do is substantiate what we're saying is true. And the reason why it's true isn't just the logic, it's is all the evidence suggested. It's a bit like, it might be useful in a science paper if I'm able to say, this happened, here's a bunch of evidence to show that, great. But if you're being critical, you go, oh, yeah, but what's your pathway for this to happen? Why does this drug do this to the body? You want to be able to answer both parts of those, not just say, here's some evidence to show that it does. Because if you just have the evidence, someone goes, I disagree with that evidence, here's my own evidence. You want to look a lot more at what the logic is underpinning it. On points of information and replies, I think both are valuable. Replies give you a bit more time to respond. Points of information give you a few seconds where you're more limited in what you can do, but you're demanding an immediate quick response from them, which is quite difficult to do. Both of those have value and are places where you can have responses to what they're saying.
Okay, so the second last question we have from Pari again.
Right, sir. Greetings. The last question. So let's say we are talking about the net zero targets, and for example, one side is debating that they're not realistic with respect to developing nations, and so basically, what do you do if the alternative solution that you're proposing with respect to your side is actually only slightly different from the opposition, which is actually not dismissing their whole point of view, which we even normally don't do, but it is just very slightly different. So you might as well just accept their point.
In that case, pick a different alternate solution, right? I mean, it's an odd one because it depends what that actually looks like, which is there still a significant difference between the two sides? And can you argue why the difference you are suggesting means something which is non-trivial? Because if you're suggesting something with all the same flaws as they do, as unrealistic as they do, with all the same drawbacks and all the same positives, yeah, you might as well just agree with them. Because you don't have much of a case in comparison to what they're saying. more likely, at some point you've probably slightly misthought this debate, and there is a greater distinction you can draw. Particularly when you have time to prepare it, it can involve you going, okay, this is actually what we stand for. Here is the big difference between our two sides. And maybe that could just be something straightforward, which is theirs is politically implausible, ours is possible. It's that theirs deals with economic issues, but doesn't deal with gender issues, and then explaining why that is so important. If you're in a position where you're basically arguing over next to nothing, you're in a very difficult position. If you are forced in that position, try and find the distinction between the two. And I think it is rare, not impossible, but rare that you will be in the position where there isn't a significant difference or difference you can make out to be significant. And to some degree, you can determine this for yourself, which is if you, this is a weird way of thinking about it, but if you're talking about development goals, there are 1,000-page papers written about very small differences. Small differences in policy can still be very significant as to what they imply. So it can be small, it still needs to be significant. And you need to say, this is the big difference between them, why ours is much better than theirs.
Hope it's clear, Pari. Then we have the last question, and that's from Ahalya.
Can you give me a fair idea on how to approach the motion? This has to compel major polluters to open their borders to environmental refugees from prop and op.
Okay. Okay, so step back, say which countries are actually being affected by it, just to begin with. So just get the lay of the land clear. And presumably we're talking primarily about major polluters. Historically, this is North American states, the US, Western Europe. If we're adding in modern countries, you're throwing in China as well. This is being done per capita, presumably, rather than in total, because otherwise things become very distorted. What exactly does your ideal world look like? There are at least two different things which you could be pushing here. One is, irrespective of the outcome, it is fair because you are saving lives directly, or second, that you are actually trying to reduce the amount of pollution in future. That's broadly where you would start with the lay of the land. What exactly you're comparing it with depends a little bit on the other side, but presumably both sides would agree that we support things like the Paris Climate Accords, other moves towards green technology, etc. But the other side presumably could not allow you to let in people from countries which are suffering from climate change, whether it be the Maldives, Bangladesh, etc. With that in mind, I think there's a few things both sides will want to be trying to prove. So on proposition, I'm going to start with the idea of, is this actually a fair solution? Do we have an obligation to help those individuals through this mechanism? That's an important distinction, who have been victims of the actions we have taken historically and continue to take today. And on some level, some of that analysis is fairly straightforward, which is we caused these problems, decisions we took, which these countries are therefore much richer because for 150 years they've been polluting, gaining as a result, while other countries have been harmed. There are directly individuals who are harmed as a result. We need to help them. Alternative mechanisms added to that probably will not be very effective. Whether that includes, for instance, long-term attempts to reduce climate emissions, great. Definitely support those. What does that do in the next 10 years for people who right now are either going to lose their homes because of flooding, lack water because of droughts, etc. There's at least one part of it. The second part of it is, do you think that increases the movement to deal with these problems in the longer term, when the polluters themselves have to pay for it? And then you're thinking a bit about the politics of climate change, which is, do you increase moves to deal with climate change, where the United States isn't just facing the occasional hurricane, which some people blame on climate change, that actually has to have an influx of refugees, arguably, or the other side which claims that there's always going to be limited political will, you already use up a large part of it. And building off that, I think that's a lot of where the op goes with this, which is either you don't have responsibility, or you don't have responsibility in this way, which is you need to do deeper green tech issues, and maybe there's a substitution effect there, or think about who's actually helped. Is it really the case that the poor individual in Bangladesh is going to be the one who's able to move to the United States? Probably not, if you just think about the logistics of trying to be a climate refugee. It is, as refugees are often, going to be individuals who are at least middle class with the ability to move from place to place. So who do you actually help as a result? And what are the alternative mechanisms, and why are they more likely to help individuals? Met with, what does this do on the politics side? So you can work on the same kinds of questions, which is, yes, we might have an obligation. Do we actually discharge the obligation with this policy? Do we cause more harms as a result because we don't deal with what's the more important issue, which is longer term climate issues, which would just lead to many millions, billions more suffering from the same kinds of problems? That's probably where the outline of the case would go.
Okay, thank you, Harish. Now I guess you answered all the questions. Hope we don't have more questions. So thank you everyone for joining in, and thank you Harish sir for joining and giving a wonderful session to our students. And we're looking them to participate in our ISDL competition. Yeah, thank you. Thanks a lot for joining everyone. Thank you, sir.
Bye everyone.